issue as an outsider, of course, to the black experience, and therefore with the requisite humility as an outsider. But at the same time, I share the same American society with people of color, and therefore I think I'm duty-bound, as are we all, to at least give thought as to how to shape my own thinking and behavior and educate myself about the black experience. We all have an ethical obligation, I think, to confront American racism and strive to reduce it in ourselves and in society at large. What I want to do, all too briefly, is look at some ideas that speak again to the stubborn and enduring character of racism, which go beyond the dynamics we currently witness. But what I want to share, I believe, remains relevant to our current understanding in the current moment. Perhaps the greatest black scholar in American history was recently mentioned, was W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I'm proud to say collaborated with our own Felix Adler, the founder of Ethical Culture, and found a hospitable platform to expound his views at the New York Ethical Society. During his long life of 95 years, Du Bois died in 1963 on the very eve of the March on Washington. He died that evening before the March on Washington. Du Bois, as the first African American to receive a PhD at Harvard, was amazingly prolific and productive. He helped found the NAACP and was the editor of its influential magazine for many years. He militantly lobbied for federal anti-lynching laws and racist restrictions which Jim Crow laws had imposed on blacks. He championed voting rights and saw strengthening education as the surest way toward equality in the furtherance of his integrationist vision for blacks in America. Du Bois opposed war and was the father of Pan-Africanist conferences which propelled the movement against European imperialism and colonialism. He was an internationalist. Du Bois plied his activism while carrying on his academic work at Atlanta University, the University of Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. He also authored path-breaking treatises on sociology and wrote the earliest academic studies of black communities. And he found time, nevertheless, to carry on ideological struggles with such black leaders as Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, who held positions different from his in terms of how to advance black interests in America. Du Bois's most notable work was, quote, The Souls of Black Folks, a series of 14 essays published in 1903 in which he described in eloquent prose the black experience written for both African American and white audiences. In his initial essay, Of Our Spiritual Strivings, that had previously been published in the Atlantic magazine, Du Bois introduced seminal concepts which remain relevant to understanding the dynamics of racism today, I believe. Among them is the notion that African Americans live behind a veil. Live behind a veil which keeps blacks alienated from mainline society, but it also created for African Americans what Du Bois referred to as, quote, a double consciousness, In Du Bois's own words, quote, after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is sort of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in the American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro, he says, is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He does not wish to Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He wouldn't bleach his Negro blood in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face, end quote. For Du Bois, this double consciousness created a perpetual tension for Black Americans. It was a tension that could lead neither to assimilation into white dominant society nor to separatism, but eventually, and somewhat optimistically, to a proud hyphenation of identity. I mean, the term African Americans had to wait another 60 years before it was coined. For Du Bois, living behind the veil and bearing this double consciousness, though born out of oppression and exploitation, gave the oppressed a special moral insight, and through struggle he believed that in a very long range, African Americans could transform themselves and all of American society for the better. In the words of Du Bois's biographer, David Levering Lewis, speaking of African Americans, quote, "Scorned and exploited throughout its history in the land of opportunity, his people had gradually undergone a halving of identity, acquired a unique angle of vision, and had become habituated to a psychic subordination that handicapped it in the past, but could be turned to strengths in the future," end quote. David Lewis refers to, quote, "this double consciousness as the primordial condition or dilemma of Du Bois's race, which had not been so nakedly exposed before," end quote. This double consciousness, generated and sustained by white supremacy, was perhaps Du Bois's most enduring idea about racism and its lasting consequences. For the most part, this double consciousness caused African Americans to depreciate their own talents as they sought to realize two identities at the same time. And it needs to be clearly stated in our time, as in his, that living two lives, being the bearers of double consciousness, is something that the white dominant majority in America simply doesn't experience and doesn't have to. It's often said that whites seldom think about race, blacks think about race all the time. Okay, in effect. As David Lewis suggests, as long as white supremacy exists, this double consciousness, again, exists as the primordial condition of being Black in America. It is an enduring dynamic of racism and the racial divide, which I conclude remains relevant in our day as it was in his. To move on. An admirer of Du Bois, and also a critic, is arguably the greatest African-American intellectual of our time, Cornel West. And here I can speak somewhat personally. Cornel West was a personal mentor of mine, and he was on when I did my first master's, he was on my orals committee, and we maintained a relationship for a good number of years. And when we had the riots in the aftermath of Philip Pennell in 1990, my God, that's 25 years ago now, we had the riots here in Teaneck, okay?
No, we did not have riots. Teaneck people did not riot. They were people who came in from Patterson and Jersey City and New York.
Okay, fine.
I remember it distinctly.
Okay, I'm not, all right, no blaming him, I'm not casting aspersions on him. It occurred here, okay, in Teaneck, okay? My own car was pelted with eggs and so on and so forth. I remember the incident personally and firsthand up close. But in 1990, I went around to black churches as well as other religious groups and so forth, and I invited Cornel West actually to come to Teaneck, and he addressed hundreds of people, packed audience in the Benjamin Franklin Middle School, very well racially balanced, because it was my view that nobody at that time could speak better across racial lines than Cornel West, and I thought it would be a step towards trying to mend the Teaneck community, and it was really, I think, a really productive evening. Anyway, while recognizing Du Bois's brilliance, West nevertheless felt that Du Bois was too optimistic, a high Victorian who appropriated the values of the European Enlightenment, which West, as a postmodern thinker, feels are deeply flawed. West probes deeply into the very emergence of modernity itself to locate the sources of white supremacy. West identifies modern racism, in fact, as constitutive of the European Enlightenment and the authority of science which flowed from it. It's a critique that I personally don't totally share, but I find it very fascinating and very compelling as far as it goes. Here's what I mean. The high watermark of the European Enlightenment of the 18th century was the era in which the ideals that we proudly celebrate, such as reason, equality, justice, freedom, and universality, were discovered, developed, and venerated so enthusiastically by a large coterie of European philosophers. They were men such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and our own Thomas Jefferson, among others. But the Enlightenment presents us with a very painful riddle. How is it that the age which gave birth to such humanistic values was also the period when Europeans were engaging in imperialistic conquests, enslaving Africans, and committing wholesale genocide against non-white people? How is it that Thomas Jefferson, who penned the magisterial phrase, quote, that all men are created equal, could own slaves whom he bought and sold at auctions, and when he looked into the face of a black person, did not quite see a human being? Indeed, all the aforementioned luminaries who expounded on universality and equality from our standpoint, or perhaps any standpoint, were anti-Semitic, misogynistic, racist bigots. Okay, this is true. You read not their published philosophical treatises, read their correspondences, and they have vile things to say about Africans, among others, each and every one of them. Okay, it's a contradiction of incredible, how should I say, the incredible, startling reality. Well, Cornel West provides an answer to this riddle. In a powerful essay entitled The Genealogy of Modern Racism, West begins as follows, quote, the notion that black people are human beings is a relatively new discovery in the modern West. The idea of black equality in beauty, culture, and intellectual capacity remains problematic and controversial within prestigious halls of learning and sophisticated intellectual circles. The Afro-American encounter with the modern world has been shaped first and foremost by the doctrine of white supremacy, which is embodied in institutional practices and enacted in everyday folkways under varying circumstances and evolving conditions, end quote. For West, racism and white supremacy, in other words, are built into the very structures of modern thought, How so? In briefest terms, Cornel West states his thesis, quote, to put it crudely, my argument is that the authority of science, undergirded by a modern philosophical discourse, guided by Greek ocular metaphors, that's the operative term, Greek ocular metaphors, promotes and encourages the activities of observing, comparing, measuring, and ordering the physical characteristics of human beings, end quote. Well, what does this mean in plain English? What it means is that when the philosophers of the European Enlightenment were creating the modern world, they looked back to Greek antiquity and Grecian ideals to fashion the norms and models as to how to think about the natural world. And when it came to the human world, Greek cultural and aesthetic ideals became the standards by which to assess and evaluate human beings. Think of those glorious sculptures by Praxiteles, the Discover and all that stuff. Those were the Grecian ideals of what the human body ought to look like, appropriated by the Enlightenment thinkers. These Grecian ideals were those that they, that is the European philosophers, needlessly to say, applied to themselves as white European males. With regard to philosophical thought upon which modern science is based, such processes as observation, evidence, measuring, and ordering became the prevailing ideas and ways in which we understand and assess the world around us. As modern people, it's our mental template when we apply thought to the world. The revival of Greek ideals of thought and beauty, according to West, creates what he calls, quote, the normative gaze, namely an ideal from which to order and compare observations. If Greek ideals put a premium on observation and set the standards for beauty, which again, white Europeans saw in themselves, then it becomes clear that people of color are construed as inferior because they stand apart from these ideal norms that constitute the very center of modern enlightened thought in the modern world. As West concludes, there is no legitimacy to the idea of black equality in beauty, culture, and intellectual capacity. In fact, to think such an idea was to be deemed irrational, barbaric, or mad, end quote. The supremacy of Greek ideals when it comes to the matter of race received a further boost from the methods and authority of modern science. In briefest terms, we can look at 18th century biology as introducing the idea of race that came into consciousness in the 18th century, as well as taxonomies by which to organize and understand the biological world. Early modern science was obsessed with the processes of categorization, comparison, ordering, and evaluating different forms of life, which in the human realm was applied to the races. Needless to say, the white race stood at the pinnacle, while blacks were universally evaluated as deeply inferior. Is this making sense? Okay, good.